start, Sue, could you introduce yourself to everyone?
Yeah, no worries, Tim. Thank you, and thanks for the opportunity to participate today. I've been working in medical device product development for over 25 years now, 20 years now. So I've been involved in the development of CPAP machines, ventilators and mask systems, wearable devices, surgical navigation systems that are used in operating theatres, different software applications for patients and clinicians, disinfection, different types of disinfection products, upgrades of quality system to ISO 13485. I've been responsible for medical device risk management as well as contributed to risk management throughout the product life cycle.
Great. And Sue also presented a webinar on usability recently. We haven't got the recording up because the sound quality was a bit problematic and we're still planning to re-record that, but yeah. So look out for that coming down the track. And Geoff, did you want to give a little bit of your background as well?
Yeah, I'll just give a little bit of an introduction to what I'll be talking about today. I don't claim to be a risk management expert per se, but I have learnt how to undertake risk management for medical devices through the School of Hard Knocks. Most recently worked very closely with Sue on the risk management aspects of the NavBit project, considering both the system level risks and software risks, and the process was successful in that we have navigated CE on the cusp of having completed FDA assessment. So what I'll be presenting today is my experiences in risk management and in particular application of ISO 14971, and I'll be relying on Sue to be a little bit of a watchdog and pull me up if I get anything wrong.
And Sue does actually run courses on risk management and on this particular standard. So the role today of Sue and myself and the format of the webinar is that Geoff will be presenting the slides, but then Sue and I will be commenting and asking questions on behalf of the audience at every slide. If you have any particular questions yourself, type them into the questions box and we'll ask them as we go. Hopefully, if you get them in quickly, we can ask them while we're still on the same slide and discussing that particular point of view. So with that, I'll ask Geoff to start the presentation.
Okay, thanks, Tim. So just to set the context, this slide shows a few examples of medical devices that Genesis has been involved in developing, and they are fairly wide and varied in their application, but they all have the common denominator. They're active medical devices in that they include electronics and software, electrically powered, and they also are subject to risk management disciplines within the context of overall medical device compliance. This is a slide that we use fairly frequently just to show the course of product development process from initial research and discovery phases through to regulatory approval, and just giving some indication of the roles of various participants in the activities that are undertaken. I won't labour the point on this slide for today's presentation, other than to say that risk management applies effectively throughout the entire process, right back at the initial design controls formation stage in collating user needs, right through to manufacturing and volume deployment of the product. Risk management does apply. It's fairly light in the early stages. It's predominantly the planning and consideration of hazards and so forth right back at the start. And the core risk management activities kick in when the development process actually starts. So what's the imperative for risk management? I like to give some evidentiary information as to why we do this. But if you ask, why do we do risk management within the context of a medical device, there are a number of wrong answers. One wrong answer is to comply with regulatory standards. Another wrong answer is to make sure we can get the product certified. The right answer is so that we can develop safe and effective medical devices where we have considered the risks that those devices pose and dealt with them in the design and development phase. And of course the subsequent production and deployment phases. The happy byproduct of that is that in doing so, we comply with the medical regulatory standards, which is a necessity to enable us to gain certification for sales of that product legally in various jurisdictions. So getting back to some specifics of where we link risk management into the medical device development process, we've identified 3 key linkages. Risk management is recognised in ISO 14971, in ISO 13485, ISO 14971 is recognised, but it's not specifically mandated, which is interesting. When you look at IEC 60601-1, it mandates the use of compliance with ISO 14971 for risk management, and similarly IEC 62304 for software development mandates risk management complying with ISO 14971. So bottom line is ISO 14971 is the Bible for risk management within the context of medical device development and deployment. So looping back on the fundamental objectives of undertaking risk management in medical device development and deployment, to develop devices that are safe for use, and the dot point there actually quotes from one of the standards, but effectively to not pose unacceptable risk of injury or damage to the health of people, in particular patients and users, but also damage to property or environment. The predominant focus of the risk management process is generally on the health, safety and well-being of the patient, and avoiding catastrophic outcomes, obviously death and serious injury and impairment, but also considering injury in the form of perhaps minor injury, and also failure to deliver a therapeutic or diagnostic outcome can cause the patient injury through the consequences of that failure. And the process is holistic throughout the entire life cycle of the product, and I have a slide coming up that explains what that is. And there is a requirement for the risk management to be managed in a structured manner with a documentation trail to prove that the processes have been undertaken.
Geoff, just on that, when you say structured, obviously Genesis has a high level of documentation and so forth. To what extent is the documentation sort of, I guess, set out by the standard versus you have to figure out what kind of structure and documentation, like do all risk management systems or the processes are used, they all look the same? Could you go to any company, they're all going to look identical and or not?
In principle, they can look dramatically different because there are different methods that one, for example, can undertake hazards analysis. Bottom line, though, is that it normally comes down to a fairly systematized and regular method of doing things, not so much because the standards 14971 mandates it, but regulatory authorities expect to see risk management done in a particular manner. And this is where we get into the slightly slippery slope domain of technical reports, which are not in fact they do not in fact define an imperative that you must follow, but you'll find the FDA, for example, tend to place a lot of credence on the technical reports that give guidance to the risk management process, and one would be foolish not to follow that. So the path of least resistance in terms of getting FDA approval, for example, is to follow the risk management as per the technical reports, even though they're not mandated by the standards. So ignore those technical reports at your peril, and I'll be talking to them during the course of the presentation.
So what's your experience of the range of different companies that you've worked in? Do they all look a little bit different, or are they the same?
Thank you. So the risk management standard has clauses, and it's your job to figure out how you're going to comply with those standards. So yeah, you can cut and dice it how you want, but what you tend to find is there's some common elements, and the reason is that because it makes it easy to find things and navigate the standard. And I'm going to give you some examples of things typically you would expect to see in a risk management file. You would need a risk management procedure, for example. You would need a risk management plan. These are documents that are reviewed and approved. They're under document controls. You would expect to do a device characterization where you go through at the start of the project and you ask a series of questions to try and understand the scope of things that you need to consider in the risk management process. For example, is the device implantable? You know, is it a diagnostic tool? Things around how the product is intended to use that is relevant and helpful to consider during the process. Of course, you're going to have different types of risk analyses. You'll have a system risk analysis or a preliminary hazards analysis. You might have different iterations of that as you move through different stages of the project. For example, earlier versions of that document may be needed to support clinical trials or system verification and validation. I would expect to see, if you're doing software, that you would have a software risk analysis that's required as part of the standard. Design FMEAs, process FMEAs. You might see some human factors FMEAs in there, but there's a whole bunch of different types of methodologies for risk analysis. For example, fault tree analysis and HAZOPs and things like that. So if you could imagine, there's a whole bunch of different types of analyses that you'd be able to go in and have a look at. And it's often divided into different subsystems. I would expect to see a risk management report. Again, that might be iterative, which really just summarizes all of the process, and it demonstrates that you've done what you said you were going to do. And then the other part of it is the post-production risk management, which is what activities you're going to do after the product is launched to make sure that you're actively monitoring the product in the field, and you're going to be on top of and addressing any issues that come up.
And that leads right into this slide, Geoff.
Yeah, and just to cap off what Sue said, the presentation today will focus on the failure modes and effects and criticality analysis pathway, other than the HAZOPs and fault tree analysis pathway, which in principle can be used, but I think it's probably fair to say that failure modes and effects analysis is probably the primary one that you'll come across, particularly for electronics and software-based devices, because it just happens to be quite aligned and suitable. So anyway,
and for the audience, you know, this is a very high-level presentation. Those different analytical tools and methodologies is another whole webinar in its own right, so we'll be getting onto that later on. But yes, sorry, go on.
There is some quite useful guidance in the what's now a technical report to a 14971, plus other technical reports around the place that do explain some of these methodologies. So there is useful information available there. In putting today's presentation together, I necessarily had to stop at a fairly superficial overview level because we could spend a whole week on this, delving down into the detail. So just to emphasize life cycle, this means the start from design and development, and most engineers would really focus on that and think, oh, design and development's done, the risk management process has ended, but you can see that's only one step on the pathway, albeit it's a pretty big step. But as Sue indicated, you have to apply the risk management process to production, so the manufacturing of the medical device itself. Its storage and distribution, so that would consider things like shelf life and temperature coverage, and whether the sterile device, for example, maintains its sterility or whether that's threatened. And then right through to servicing. If it's a serviceable device, do you increase risk by not appropriately servicing the equipment? And even through to decommissioning. For example, if the device can present an environmental or biological hazard when it's disposed of.
Geoff, to what extent do you need to people involved in the design and development need to be cognizant of these other stages in the life cycle?
I guess generally to be aware of them, and certainly all of these issues need to be addressed. So the design and development engineers may not be heavily involved in some of the nitty-gritty detail down the track, but it certainly pays for them to be aware of these issues, because they, for example, in the decommissioning phase, there are requirements in design for disassemblability and so forth. So there are certainly design implications that can be imposed by some of these other steps. And when the risk management process is done and a hazards analysis is performed, normally all of these items will be addressed, so the design engineers will be exposed to them during that process and then become aware of requirements for their design that may be imposed by those later stage activities.
Sue, you got any comments on that?
Risk management, you know, it can be quite a big job if you've got a big system. So I tend to find you've got a systems engineer often who provides oversight of the risk management program. I think it's important to identify the high-level hazards, and then you tend to find that specialists, for example, production engineers, might focus on that particular subsection of the risk management. So there's oversight at the top, but then you get kind of specialists in to complete different parts of it, for example, electrical or software or human factors. It's definitely a team effort.
Okay, let's move on.
Okay, so we've got a couple of slides to just look specifically from the perspective of individuals within an organisation or roles within an organisation. Why does it matter? So in summary, CTO, and this reflects upon the entire engineering team, why does it matter to them? And apart from the obvious, as you've been told to do it, the underlying thing that matters is achieving safe and effective designs. And the best way to achieve that is to have risk management built into the culture of the organisation. Don't regard it as an impost of something you have to do resentfully, but embrace it and say, well, I should be thinking at all stages when doing a design, hardware and software, and at the system level, what are the risks and what can I do to minimize those risks? So the sort of considerations that a good engineer will think about is always, really simple example, if you have a power supply feed, always put fuse protection on it, always put reverse polarity protection on it, always put EMC control measures on it, so that you are designing in risk containment as a natural part of your engineering design process. And that can follow through, for example, in a control system, you might want to have dual redundant control. One technique that we use quite regularly is to use a state machine based PLD or FPGA device to control critical interactions, then have that operating in parallel with a microcontroller that does the higher level control function, but the underlying state machine will prevent that software from doing anything crazy. So you have a redundant control system that builds in risk containment. And if you think along those lines at the very start, then when you get into the details of your risk management process, you'll find that you have risk mitigations built into your core design as a natural part of your design process, and you don't then have to really disrupt the design later on by putting in risk containment measures. So in summary, develop a culture of managing risk as you go along through the design process. So from the CEO's perspective, obviously the focus is on getting the product onto the market legally, therefore the need to meet certification requirements of regulatory bodies, and that in turn means meeting the requirements of the regulatory standards. And I'll look a little bit more detail in the specific standards in the next slide. So this is, the CEO is definitely going to be concerned with making sure that everything's done that needs to be done to allow the product to go through the regulatory process smoothly and quickly. And of course, the quality manager is well aligned with the CEO in that regard. So having a bit more look at the regulatory standards that apply, and I use a similar presentation to the slide to this and other presentations to show the key headline medical standards that we'll be dealing with. And the linchpin is ISO 13485, which is quality system standard, and ISO 14971 is the risk management standard, goes arm in arm with that. And I've also identified a technical report. The new version of 14971, the 2019 update, has changed from the previous version in that what used to be annexes have now moved into a technical report. So there was a different structure, so you get to actually pay more money because you need 2 documents rather than 1. It is a sensible decoupling though, because it's taking out all the guidance information and separating it out from the core applicable clauses. And just as an aside, I personally find ISO 14971 a very well written, useful and easy to apply standard. Easy to apply in the sense that there's not a lot of doubt in what you need to do. Doesn't mean it's actually easy to achieve it. Whereas some other standards can be somewhat obtuse and they show signs of having evolved. Whereas 14971 is actually a fairly clear and concise standard. So, Sue, have you got any thoughts? Do you concur with that? Or? I think Sue might be muted.
Can you hear me again, Geoff?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, sorry, I was muted. Yeah, Geoff, I agree with that. I think what we're seeing a lot more these days is this interconnectivity between standards, and that can be a little bit tricky to wrap your head around sometimes. So they seem to, you've got, you know, your 13485 and it's interconnected with your risk management and your software and your human factors. And I think that it does work. You can make sense of it. But I think they're pretty straightforward. There's good guidance, I think, in the risk management standard. For example, a risk management report, it does tell you exactly what you need to include. So it's quite helpful.
There's an increasing number of standards calling up 14971, and I haven't got 62366 usability on this slide. It could well have a place, but there are many standards where risk, or many regulatory standards where risk is a concern, and a number of them call out 14971. So I've just put on this slide the headline ones. So 60601-1 for electrical medical device safety is very heavily focused on risk management. It's mentioned dozens of times through the document. And also 62304 explicitly calls out 14971. And there's technical report, TR 8002-1, which gives guidance on how to apply 14971 in the software compliance environment. And there's some
Can you explain
points of contention in that if we have time at the end, I'll share some anecdotes. But
Geoff, can you explain the difference between a standard and a technical report?
Well, the official view is that the standard has the normative clauses which are applied and with which you must comply. The cynical view could be that the technical reports are actually more important because that's what organisations like the FDA tend to focus on. So, but sort of humour aside, the technical reports are not officially are not officially required to follow the guidance in them, but avoid doing so at your peril, because the regulators do rely very heavily on the guidance in those technical reports. The bottom line is, if you're going to do risk assessment or management for software against IC 6304, it's almost essential that you refer to that companion technical report.
So notice in the top right-hand corner, you've got it called guidance on application of 14971, or 24971, is it? Oh, yes, 14971. So can you just briefly describe, you know, the kind of content you would expect to see? Is it simply expanding on what's already, is it commenting on what's in the standard?
Sorry, in the actual risk management process?
No, in the technical reports.
Oh, a technical report really takes clauses. There might be a one clause, a couple of sentence clause in the standard, and the technical report will expand that out to maybe pages of explanatory information, including examples of. So it's the standard states very succinctly and blandly what you must achieve, and the technical report gives you explanatory detail. Firstly, on why that's the case, so it gives context. and gives guidance on actually how to achieve it. So they're almost like a recipe for how to comply with the standard.
So how many technical reports would there be per standard?
Not always a one-to-one, but most standards will have either a technical report or they may have that information by way of annexes. So 60601-1 has all that explanatory information in annexes within the standard rather than a separate technical report. But generally speaking, most standards will have that explanatory information present in some form or other. And generally there will be 2 or 3 technical reports for each of these headline standards with focusing on different aspects of them.
So it's obviously a bit of a job getting your head around all the different reports that you have to read. So you got any comments about, the process of getting your head around all of this?
Look, I would start with the standard, and then often I find some of these other reports, they're helpful. It's like, oh, okay, that's what they meant, because it can take a little bit of deciphering. And if you haven't done it before, it's like, well, what's supposed to be in a risk management plan, and so there's a lot of discussion around severity, for example, and occurrence, and why. And I guess I just see them as they're not mandatory to follow. However, it's helpful, and I think if you can, if you don't fundamentally disagree with what's in there, it's a good idea, I think, to take the recommendations. Some guidance documents actually you can't really follow. The human factors one's an example. There's a guidance document for that, which, you can pull things out of it as you need to support the design process, but it's too big. It's more of a look something up to help you do something type of guidance document.
Okay, so they're a bit different.
Yeah.
I have had cases with both quality auditors and compliance assessors who are calling up clauses in technical reports as if they were mandatory normative parts of the standard. So unless you want to get into a fight, certainly it pays to follow the guidance whenever it's practical, and also it is in many cases extremely useful. Okay, we need to move along a bit here. This, without labouring on a point, looking what the definition of risk is, and it's consistent across all of these documents. It's a combination of the probability of occurrence of harm and severity of that harm. And I've got a couple of slides following on. This is a very definition-rich environment, and if you follow down the tree of all the definitions that call up other definitions, it gets quite complex. But there are some core concepts that you really need to get your head around to be able to make sense of this. So starting the headline in risks, probability of occurrence of harm and the severity of that harm. So a high probability event of moderate harm would pose a certain risk. A rare event of a much more severe harm might pose a similar risk because its probability of occurrence is much lower. So jump in, Tim, if there's anything I'm skipping over that's unclear.
Well, I'm more interested to hear what Sue might have to say about all of this.
I'll maybe skip to the next slide because it's got a bit more meat in it. So I've just plucked out some of the key definitions from 1 through 485, and they are consistent across the other standards as to what we're dealing with. So I've put risk back at the top. Risk of probability of harm, where harm is injury or damage to health of people or damage to property of the environment. And severity, it's not described in terms of a definition, but it can range from minor discomfort of a patient through to death of a patient or operator or anything in between. So where risk management is the process of trying to reduce risk by a combination of reducing the probability of occurrence of harm, and to some degree it's actually possible to reduce the severity of the harm, though in some cases that's not possible. If you're electrocuted and you die, then you're dead, and there's not much you can do to only be partly dead, unless you're Schrodinger's cat. So then it comes to harm I've mentioned. So a hazard, what's a potential source of harm? And this leads into hazardous situations, and the other definition is sequences of events. So what are the things that have to go wrong before a hazardous situation arises? And usually, for example, the crash of an aircraft, it's not just one thing. It's usually a cascading sequence of events have to occur before someone is exposed to a hazardous situation that can cause some harm. And the part of the risk management process is to determine what those sequences of events might be in a real world situation, and using the principle that if it can go wrong, it will go wrong. So it brings us to risk analysis. So it's the process, and this gets back to the systematic process I mentioned at the start, systematically identifying hazards and working through to say what is the probability of the hazardous situation occurring and what is the probability of consequential harm, and combination of those two elements gives rise to an assessment of the level of risk associated with that particular sequence of events. So risk management is the process of analysis and then deciding what to do to minimize the level of risk that to which we're exposing patients, operators, other people, and also property in the environment. So that's really a very sort of in a nutshell how the definitions lead to the risk management process. So just jump into the next slide, and this is extracted from one from 971, and I've put up the contents list of the standard, and it aligns reasonably well with the flow chart to show what the risk management process at the high level consists of. So you see the risk management plan that Sue alluded to really is a document that's produced at the start of the project that says, how are we going to go about this process within the context of our particular system and product? Because although the flow chart is sort of fairly generic in terms of what you'd need to do, the actual detail of that is highly dependent on the nature of the actual system or product you're dealing with, its complexity, and what its inherent risk profile is. Is it something that's very benign, that's highly unlikely to cause anyone any harm or damage? Or is it something, for example, a life support system? Recent good case is a respiratory ventilator, for example, that if it fails, it can actually damage or kill the person by not by what it does to the person, or it can leave the person to die by not doing its job. So that's an example of an extremely potentially high risk device. And incidentally, the risk profile of a device links directly to its classification within the certification domain. There's a very tight coupling between risk and device certification.
Excuse me,
So
Geoff.
in terms of the process
Geoff,
follows
Sue had a comment.
Oh, sorry, Sue.
Geoff, we've just had a question here from one of the participants, Luke, and thank you for sending that the question along. That's great. So the question was, when does risk management start for a medical device? For example, when the product starts selling, or after the first 100 units are sold, or earlier? And I just wanted to answer that one. Formally, it starts as soon as you enter formal design control. So as soon as you've kicked off the project, but I would encourage you to start thinking about it sooner than that. A good starter step is to have a risk or hazards brainstorming. It can be quite easy and fun, believe it or not, to just get all of those hazards out of your system and down on a bit of paper. But it will, but the formal risk management process will start when you enter formal design controls.
And before that, you obviously have to do the planning. So before you start design controls, you have to do all the plans for that design control process. One of the mandatory plans is your risk management plan. And it's really difficult to create a risk management plan out of the air. You really have to have knowledge of some of the processes that you're going to be following before you can actually plan them properly. So that really brings it back right early into the early stage project planning.
Thanks for that, Sue. For some bizarre reason, I can't see that question in my Q&A panel. So I did actually, my internet dropped out early and I've had to log back on, so possibly may have lost that. So if you do see any other questions, do please raise them. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so the flowchart here is focusing predominantly on the design process, but it also applies to the manufacturing process and also to the what we'll call the post-production and post-production activities in the box at the bottom. But the key focus of the detail that's displayed here mainly applies during the design and development process. So risk analysis, you need to know the intended use and reasonably foreseeable misuse. How is the device going to be used and by whom and when to do what? But you also have to think about what could go wrong in the use of that device. So how can it be misused in a foreseeable manner? And you have to take the idiot factor into account. What could you reasonably foreshadow that someone may do in terms of misusing the device? So I won't labour through all the dot points here, but you can see the general flow. So characteristics related to safety are things that what can affect the safety. So obviously an electrically powered device can potentially electrocute someone if things go horribly wrong, or a device that needs to be sterile can cause someone an infection if it's not sterile. So these are the sorts of characteristics that you need to identify to say, yeah, these can affect the safety of the device. And for software device, obviously software bugs.
Geoff, I'm just wondering, how does this relate, or how is this different from the ISO 31000 generic risk management standard?
Not dramatically different. The principles are pretty much the same. I guess 14971 is heavily focused specifically on medical, so it's slanted towards medical aspects or medical device aspects, but the general principles of risk management are not dissimilar across a number of different standards. And similarly, when you get into the hazards analysis part, there are a whole heap of different standards that look at hazards from a different point of view. Their principles are very similar. It's just the particular standards are tailored to the domains that they address. So having identified the characteristics of the device that potentially can cause a hazard and a safety issue, we want to identify them and do that in a structured and orderly manner. So the third dash point in the first box, identification of hazards and hazardous situation and risk estimation, is really the meat of the process. And this is where the failure modes and effects analysis, or failure modes, effects and criticality analysis comes into play. To give you an example, you'd think for a relatively simple device, you would probably have at least 100 entries into the analysis table looking at hazardous situations and analysing them, and probably a similar number of the order of 100 specifically related to software. And so it does become quite an onerous process. And even for a simple device, you should be thinking about many person months of endeavour to go through this risk analysis process. So having identified those hazardous situations, we need to estimate the risk. And a critical part of that is to know what the harm that can occur as a result of that risk might be and quantify that. To do that successfully, you really need to take recourse to the clinicians who have expertise in the area. So an engineer can obviously work out what electrocution might cause, but when you look at 60601-1, it looks at electrical leakage currents within the context of invasive cardiovascular procedures where much lower currents can cause harm. When you come to biological hazards, for example, or infection control, you really do need to engage with the clinicians to be able to work out what the harm scenarios are and what their severities might be to enable you to determine what the level of risk is. I'm mindful of time here, so I might have to start scurrying. So having evaluated the risks, you categorize the risks by acceptable, in other words, below a certain criteria that you deem you can live with, risks which are unacceptable, or risks which might be extreme. Any risks that's in the unacceptable or extreme category, you must apply risk control measures to reduce the ultimate level of risk to which you expose the patient, the staff using devices in the environment, and that must be done in a structured and justified manner. I'll look at a little bit more details of a method to do that shortly. And you follow through from that to either you then determine that you are able to reduce risk to an acceptably low level for each particular risk, or if you are unable to do that, there is a recourse to a process called risk-benefit analysis. I like a really good example of this. If you have a scalpel, there is a risk you may cut yourself with it. And if the scalpel is to do its job, that risk must be there. You can't have a blunt scalpel because you don't want the surgeon to risk cutting himself. So the risk-benefit analysis is that the surgical effect that you can achieve by using a scalpel, the benefit of that outweighs the risk of the surgeon cutting themselves or breaching their sterile barrier of their gloves, for example. So it's a good example of a risk-benefit analysis.
Geoff, are you meant to be on the slide with the coloured?
I'll just jump to that. I'm probably about time to jump over this, but I'll just finish the summary here that after applying risk control, you then have to look at the overall risk. So taking all the risks together, what is the net risk? Because you can't just look at the risk in isolation and work out the total risk to the patient. Then a formal risk management review, and then decisions are made about, can we proceed down a certification path with that product based on that risk profile? And once the product is in the market, there are activities required, surveillance, to determine whether the risk decisions and conclusions that were drawn during the development process were in fact sound based on information that you gather from the field. And I won't labour on that point. So just skipping to the next slide. This gives a little bit more detail on how one might go about the process of analysing hazards and then determining whether they present unacceptable risk. And it's quite important to get your head around the concept of these two probabilities, P1 and P2, that are, and this is an extract from 14971. So P1 is the risk of a hazardous situation occurring. So what can cause something to go wrong? For example, if you're flying an aeroplane and the sequence of events is that your pitot tube gets blocked, and then the blocked pitot tube exercises some bugs in the software that controls flight controls. The pilots in that can then get confused and take inappropriate action and then crash the plane. So a whole sequence of things have to go wrong before the catastrophic outcome of crashing the plane occurs. So you can ascribe a probability that each of those steps in that sequence will occur. And this is a tricky thing to do this in a coherent and justified manner, to say what is the probability of those events. And it's generally necessary to engage with the clinicians who will have information to say, in their experience, for example, in surgery, what is the likelihood of this particular event occurring that can lead to a hazardous situation? In the case of electrical design, when you've got isolation barriers for isolating mains from the patient, you then have to look at what is the probability that there will be a failure that will cause the electrical conductivity of dangerous currents through the patient, for example. So at the end of the day, you come up with an event probability, or an estimation of the probability that the hazardous situation might occur. But then there's a second probability. What is the probability that that hazardous situation will actually cause harm to the patient? For example, you could have a sequence of hazards that occur and the operator of the equipment determines, oh, that equipment is obviously faulty, therefore I will not apply it to the patient, or I'll get a new device from store. So even though the hazardous situation has eventuated, it doesn't actually result in harm to the patient. And there are other situations. A good example is surgery. If you have a problem that causes the duration of anesthesia to be extended, that may or may not harm the patient. Some patients may have no effect, other patients may suffer nausea. So just because a hazardous situation occurs, you don't necessarily know that it's going to cause harm. So at the end of the day, those two probabilities contribute to a net probability that the hazardous situation occurs and does actually cause harm. So on the right-hand side, we look at, say, what is the actual severity of that harm? And the circumstances around the hazard can affect the ultimate level of severity of the harm, and obviously the impact on the patient. So raising from very minimal issues such as maybe a little bit of discomfort or maybe an extension of the duration of a procedure on a patient, through to the extreme where the patient dies because the device kills them, or they die because the device doesn't save them, and anything in between. And you typically find that most of the hazards that you're dealing with are somewhere in between, that they can cause an intermediate level of harm to the patient, for example, may require them to undergo a subsequent procedure, or may leave them with some medium term impairment or discomfort that requires extra physiotherapy, for example. And at the end of the day, you then have to make an assessment for each of the possible harm outcomes, how severe it is. And then risk is determined by the probability of the event occurring and the severity of that event. So the table on the right shows one method of making this determination, and this diagram appears in a similar form in many of the technical reports and guidance documents. The actual details will vary, but this is a pretty good example that you can use practically. Say low risk events, color-coded green, so either frequent events with negligible severity of outcome, or events with a very low probability of occurring that have a critical outcome, can be rated as a low overall risk to a particular patient on a particular use of that device.
Geoff, this all looks very logical and straightforward. I'd just like to ask Sue, in practice, when you actually have an actual device in the real world, when you're trying to figure through all this, does it get a lot messier, or is it as simple as it looks here?
In risk management, particularly when you get to the risk analysis stage and you're trying to review hazards, it can, it's common to get into lots of conversations about, well, is it a hazard? Is it a harm? Is it a hazardous? Really kind of distinguishing and having clarity around those different things. And, for example, infection, you can have a range of infection severities from very low to quite high. It could be quite serious. So that's where you can get particular hazards that can be quite difficult to classify. And I guess it's important that you own your tables. Normally you have to, as a part of the standard, define the risk threshold acceptability criteria in your risk management plan at the start of the project. So that's important to discuss and kind of get aligned on what's a high risk and what's not a high risk, and the threshold above which you'll start doing stuff. In general, and also to meet European requirements, you need to mitigate and put risk controls in until the risk is as low as possible. So not just when it gets into the low level, but you have to keep going. So that's kind of another factor there. But yeah, it can get a little bit messy, and it's good. It's a good process. I think it's a good discussion. They're important discussions to have, but there's certainly some tricky aspects of trying to figure out if things are safety related or not.
And Luke is asking, does the probability need to be informed by some clinical study / sensors, or is it just informed by some edge guess? and I would add to that, and I've seen this often, you go to a doctor to get an opinion, and you go to another doctor to get a second opinion, and quite often their expert opinions are quite substantially different. So how do you deal with that kind of situation?
That's a really good question, and it's common. I think about it as a hierarchy. Try and find evidence if you can from literature, or, there's a lot of database, the more database. A lot of the different regulatory bodies have issues around different hazards and data on that. So you can get a starting point for probability. It's tricky if you haven't, it's a new product in its category and you don't have any information. Then you've kind of got to work down the hierarchy, looking at expert opinion based on experience. If there's nothing else, you've got to use that if you've got no resort. So, but yeah, try and look at getting evidence as you can. And when your products launch, it's a little bit easier because you can actually collect real data on what's happening and feed that back into your risk analysis to get more robust occurrence information?
Yeah, I find the hardest thing to do is to come up with a realistic assessment of P1 or the component parts of P1 when you don't actually have any evidentiary or factual basis on which to determine that. And there's obviously the temptation to game the system and put it low so everything goes green, but I actually try and do the opposite. I try and take a very pessimistic view of the probability to highlight the risks and then make a determination of what a mitigation might be. And quite often you'll come up with something that looks like an absolutely horrendous risk because of the probability being high and the harm being high. But you'll then find that there is a clear-cut mitigation that can reduce that residual risk to an extremely low level. And so you'll get much better brownie points for someone assessing your hazards analysis if you have a substantial number of medium and high risk on the first pass of the assessment that have sound mitigations for those risks. That's a much safer pathway to follow than I'll just bump that one down a bit to get it green.
I think in the beginning of the process, you can spend a lot of time trying to invent numbers for a probability of occurrence. Sometimes it's more useful to just hook in and really just focus on getting the severity sorted out. And that can be kind of a good guide to help you prioritize your highest risk items as a starting point.
I'd like to give it a bit of a sanity check. For example, if you have all your probabilities of failure of electronics too high, you work out what the net probability of failure is, and you work out that the device will fail within 30 seconds of switching it on. Now, if your net probability of all your failures indicates that type of scenario, obviously you're being too pessimistic in those probabilities, because you've got to take real world events into consideration. But it does get really tricky, and there's no magic bullet answer to it. And I think inevitably in any risk analysis, you'll come down with a certain number of sequences of events that cause a great deal of angst in trying to sort them out. Okay, we should move on. So looking specifically at software, which has its own set of requirements as defined in 6304 for its risk management process. Sorry, Tim.
Geoff, I'm just noticing we've only got 3 minutes officially left. We'll go to 10 past. But Kevin to make some comments, so we need to add at least 5 minutes. Time.
I'm going to scoot through pretty quickly now. So I won't labour the point on software risk management because it's a whole new category to consider. But in software hazards, some of them arise from the system's hazards. So if the system is function is reliant on software, then software failing can trigger that particular system hazard. But software have its own little bundle of thing called common core software hazards, which are things that can arise simply by the implementation of software, giving rise to bugs, things like stack overflows and memory violations and all those sorts of things that a good software engineer will deal with in the development of the software. But it is necessary to consider software specific hazards as well as system hazards caused by software. And finally, you'll often have recourse that system level risks require mitigations in software. And that opens up a whole new set of requirements that you have to actually validate that the software mitigation of those system risks is sound. So this is a topic for another day to go into detail about the software risk management as opposed to system risk management, but the two must go hand in hand. Sue, I don't know if your experiences from confronting software risk management for the NavBit product, if you've got any pearls of wisdom to add.
Oh, I think the trickiest part of the software risk management, so it has to, it references the system risk analysis, but the trickiest part I think is that assumption of 100% failure. And how do you do that? How do you design your software if you've got, that's your starting point?
The technical report has a point in it that I take issue with that says, in doing your risk analysis, you assume the risk of software failure is 100%. So to me, that means every time you switch your PC on, it crashes, and every time you power up your iPhone, it crashes. So it's a nonsensical proposition. The sensible interpretation of it is, in assessing initial risk, assume that the software failure occurs, but then in looking at residual risk, assume that measures that have been applied are effective in reducing that probability of software failure. For example, complying with IEC 62304. If applying IEC 62304 does not reduce the risk of software faults occurring, there's no point in having it existing. So it is an interesting challenge. And I'll talk in a future slide about another very important aspect of risk mitigation. And this is this as low as reasonably practical versus as far as possible that's come into the EU MDD. Now, as an engineer, reducing risk as far as possible, do I have a dual redundant microcontroller or a triple redundant microcontroller or a quad redundant microcontroller or a 78 microcontrollers all providing redundancy? At what point does the risk reduce? So it becomes a bit nonsensical, this as far as possible. So what it really means is, what it's intended to stop is people taking economic considerations into account and saying, we're not going to reduce risk further because it will make the product X% more expensive. Even that has been challenged within the EU, because there is an EU directive that requires medical technology and therapies to be cost effectively available to the general public. So to my mind, this as far as possible thing is a bit of a can of worms, and it does cause angst when saying, well, how far do we reduce risk? But there is an escape hatch, and there's a particularly important clause of IEC 60601-14213, and I'll read it out. Where the standard or its collateral or particular standards specify requirements addressing particular hazards or hazardous situations, together with specific acceptance criteria, compliance with these requirements is presumed to establish that residual risks have been reduced to acceptable levels unless there is objective evidence to the contrary. So what that means, if a hazard is addressed within 60601-1, for example, electrical hazards, if you comply with the standard and with its risk specific criteria, in other words, it says you must achieve certain levels of insulation and isolation. If you do that and prove that you've done so by 60601-1 report, then you are deemed to have reduced risk to an acceptably low level. So this provides a method of saying, how low do I have to reduce the risk? Now, of course, not every hazardous situation is addressed by 60601-1, but a really big chunk of them are. And so this is a really important clause to bear in mind when deciding how far you need to reduce risk. Okay, I'll just maybe pause there for a sec. So, Sue, do you have any comment on that, on the AFAP thing and how that actually applies in practice?
I guess a comment I would make is make sure you don't use the term ALARP in your documents. You will get pinged on that in an audit.
Yeah.
As far as possible, I think that what that means in practice is, can you think of any way that we can reduce this? And you get the risk further, you get to the point where you just can't think of anything else. And that's kind of, it feels, that's when you've got there. Do you know what I mean? You do as much as you can to reduce it as far as possible.
And I think my preferred approach is to rely very heavily on compliance with 60601-1 via hardware. Rely on the fact that you're applying IEC 62304 to your software. So this gives you this inherent safety by design component. You are following these standards and rigorously designing for safety. Therefore, you have by design reduced the risk associated with the product compared with had you not followed those pathways. So just take a couple of minutes just to say this is my attempt at a practical approach to risk management. I think the audience probably will have gathered that this is quite a complicated activity and difficult thing to deal with, and so you do really need to have a structured approach to it. And so this is my cheat sheet, if you like, on how to go about doing it. the very first thing is panel a risk management board or committee of all the stakeholders in your project and nominate people from each of the participating organisations or each of the expert domains who will be responsible for participating in the risk management process and ultimately making the decisions on things like have we reduced risk far enough. The step right at the start of the project is a risk management plan, and we've talked about that and what it needs to contain, but it's very important that that's a formal, stringent document, and trust me, quality system assessors and certification assessors will be looking for that plan and make sure it existed at the start and wasn't done retrospectively. And they'll be looking for dates and sign off on when you had your risk management plan in place. Extremely important. Now, of course, a lot of the hazards and risks are associated with the applicable standards. So another planning activity you should be doing anyway is identifying all the technical standards that apply and their applicability. But in doing that, analyze them to see where where risk comes into play, either explicitly in those standards or by implication. So the next thing, clinical hazards, engage with the clinicians, the experts using the device or the experts in the environment who can tell you what really, from their experience, are the hazards and hazard situations that they're concerned with. So this goes beyond the things that 60601-1 identifies, for example, electrocution, which the engineers know about. This goes into the domain of the people actually using the device clinically to know what the hazards and ultimate risks are. So following the process through, the technical hazards, the engineers have their part to play in terms of their design. If it can go wrong, it will go wrong, to work out what the issues are they're dealing with. And a very important consideration of 60601-1 is avoidance of hazardous situations arising from single point of failure. So you've got to assume any component part of the system can fail, and does that give rise to a hazardous situation? We'll then follow through for the determine the probabilities of hazardous situation occurring and probability of harm, to work out the ultimate probability and to determine what the risk is for each of those sequences of events. And noted here that during this process, assume that software will fail. So any contribution of software to a hazard is assumed to occur. Then go through the analysis process, determine the risks that are unacceptably high. And it's really important in this to put a common sense filter over the top. And I like to gather the governance panel and say, well, we've said that these risks are the high risks, do you concur? And are there any risks that don't come up as high risk that you think should be high risk? So just apply a common sense filter over the top in case the analysis has given a result that doesn't gel with people's experience. So once we've determined the risk we need to deal with, we apply the risk control procedures or risk mitigation procedures to try and reduce those risks to an acceptable level, once again in terms of an objective calculation based on the reduced probability of hazardous situation occurring that is a consequence of the risk mitigation measures. Once we're left with residual risk that we can't reduce any further, we then analyse that to say if that's acceptable, and if it's deemed not acceptable, undertake a cost-benefit analysis to say that the therapeutic or diagnostic benefit of the device outweighs that residual irreducible risk. Of course, in determining risk mitigation measures, we must verify that the risk control measures have in fact worked and are effective. So if you've got software watchdogs to reduce the risk of software crashes causing loss of function, you've got to make sure that the watchdog actually works. Then at the end of this whole process, there is a review process, once again from this governance panel, to determine that the overall risk is in fact has been successfully reduced to a level that everyone's comfortable with, and then produce a report to document all the outcomes. So Sue, if you've got any comments on how that aligns with your view of the world?
Geoff, thank you for going through that. Look, I think that's a good introduction and overview to the different aspects of the process I guess my key message are it's a collaborative process. It's iterative. Start it soon. It's almost impossible to do it right at the last minute. It can be fun, so don't lose hope in that. And it's a really great process to help get great design outputs and that are safe and great products. So I know it might be a bit overwhelming if you're looking at it for the first time, but it can be broken down and simplified, and you can make sense out of it. So yeah, thanks, Geoff, for going over that.
I find personally in doing these things, my brain gets cluttered up with a whole heap of stuff that causes a great deal of angst. And the process of writing that down on paper is actually very therapeutic, because you're clearing your mind of all these things by actually getting it documented. And because the other thing I say, if it's not written down, it hasn't been thought about. What that means, you might think you've thought about something, but once you come to try and write it down in a coherent manner, the depth of consideration that you need to apply is infinitely greater than the non-written thought process. So this can be actually quite a cleansing and therapeutic process to go through in terms of getting it down on paper and clearing the clutter out of your mind.
I might just at this point ask Kevin Baden to make a comment, because and this is actually a good segue, who can help. We do actually have another consultant online, Kevin Baden, who gave our previous presentation on risk management. And I'll just unmute Kevin. So Kevin, can you speak? Are you there?
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Sue and Geoff, and of course, Dr. Tim, for organizing the presentation, the session. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Yeah,
good.
Comments
yeah,
you wanted to make?
I've been following from the start, and I noticed a couple of things probably would like to make a comment on. ISO 13485 require us to address risk management for the product as well as for the processes, which is good maybe to add at the start of such a presentation. And that will take us to the question which was raised, when to start. Definitely, as Geoff mentioned, you start from the concept downwards, because your risk input, your risk management is an input to the design, which is where to start. And on the planning side, at the start of the project, many cases people ignore the risk coming from the suppliers, from the service providers, the resources required, and one of the main things which is sometimes missed or not well addressed is the compliance to regulatory requirements, especially when device team trying to find the best class for the device. So there's a lot of risks there as well, must be addressed at that start. On the level where for the standards applicable, I noticed from the list, I know you're not listing all the applicable standards, but on the safety one, there is another important standard to be considered sometimes for certain devices with the 61010, along with 60601, which is applicable to a good number of devices where they are used in the labs. So that's one. And one standard blends well with the risk management, which used to be actually before part of the risk assessment, is a 62366. So that's probably worth mentioning if this presentation comes up again. But then that leads me to my probably final comment, or the one below the final, before the final, is the 14971 clearly said the risk must be assessed for the devices in a normal mode as well as for the processes too, and in fault mode, which is really an area in many cases when we review the risk management documents, it's missing and is not well highlighted. So that's very important aspect to look for. And then just the last bit is that risk, whether the mitigation, the proposed mitigation, add a risk to the risk, add a new risk or not. Again, sometimes people do it, but they don't document that in the report, that they're confirming whether the mitigation did not introduce any new risk. That's it. Thank you very much for the presentation. Great.
Yeah, look, thanks a lot. Any comments from Sue or Geoff responding to that?
Oh, I just wanted to thank Kevin for that. That was really great. Thank you for sharing your experience as well. I know you've got like a lot of heritage there in the medical device industry, so I appreciate your comments there.
Yeah, thanks,
We're all
Kevin.
learning.
I think Kevin's sort of scratching a little bit deeper below the surface, and there are a lot of we could go to a great deal of depth in some of the aspects that you need to deal with and some of these subtleties, and it does get a little bit convoluted when you go down this path of particularly the hazards introduced, and if you have hazard risk mitigation measures in software, does that risk mitigation in software cause a new risk at the system level? So the whole thing becomes iterative, and it looks as though you could go on forever, but I mean, ultimately you have to bring it to a conclusion.
Yeah. Anyway, thank you for that. Thank you for letting me make my comment.
Thank you, Kevin. And look, we have run over time, so I might, unless there's any other burning comments from the audience or from the panelists, I think we might call the webinar to a close. Geoff, if you could just move to the final, the next slide. So that's the next one, the last one. Yeah, that's it. I just want to highlight this great web presentation coming up from Tiller Design. Tiller have been involved in one of the largest translational research of fundamental medical technology into design, and with this particular device, it's actually a brain scanner. Normally you take a patient to a brain scanner, but in this case they're taking brain scanning device to the patient. There was one final question, sorry, that's just come through from Angus Hetfield, and I'll just quickly read it out. I think it's worth discussing. Since being exposed to deliberate risk management in medical device development, I have become more aware that I have always done risk assessments to a large degree in both my professional and personal life without perhaps being aware of it. I have heard of the term risk-based approach, but I really think that in some ways it is moot, because everything we do in life and the decisions we take should account for risk, e.g. the pros and cons of each situation. What do you think of that?
I'll comment briefly on that. That's a perfectly reasonable justification, and some people apply that more rigorously in their life than others, and usually the older you get, the more rigorously you apply it. It's probably fair to say that 149 is just systematizing that process. So rather than do it on an ad hoc gut feel basis where you may or may not deal with the whole risks or may not identify all the risks, it's actually systematizing it and doing it in a controlled, numerical, evidence-based process, just bringing formality to that whole activity. But certainly any engineer is worth his salt. Risk management and risk control is sort of second nature to them.
Great. Any final comments from, still got Kevin online or Sue?
Oh, I was just going to say, it's great that it makes sense. Like the philosophy of risk management makes sense. The standard provides a structure for us, and it's important to provide the deliverables. So like you may apply risk management, but you may not have a risk management plan for those things that you're moving through. And I think that's the difference. There's certain kind of aspects of it that need to be addressed and a process that you go through. But I think having a starting point that it makes sense, I think that's telling me it's probably going to be easy for you to understand what you need to do and adopt it as a framework.
I try to go along to risk management workshops extremely well prepared, and I've never gone along to one where a whole range of things I hadn't thought about hadn't come up because someone else had thought about them. So however rigorously you try and think things through in your own right, someone else will always come up with a different perspective. So there's certainly a lot of value in the systematic approach and bringing as many brains to bear as possible.
Yeah, if I can may add the last plea for medical devices engineers, just to read the essential requirements before they do anything else. And they have to do to read the new one for the MDR now, which is maybe 3 times as long. But by reading that essential requirement document, Annex 1 in the directive, or now it is in the new MDR, really it opens the eyes for engineers what to do, what to look for, and what to do, and where to find the answers that leads them to the way which standard they need to read.
And I guess I'll probably comment on that. Definitely agree with Kevin's position, and don't be intimidated by it, because particularly for an experienced engineer, you'll find the vast majority of what you see in there is stuff you do anyway, and it's just common sense and good engineering practice, but just systematized.
Yeah.